It has generally been believed that the impulses towards imperial expansion that characterized European politics in the closing years of the 19th century had made conflict inevitable. And the theories of imperialism, particularly those coming from Hobson and Lenin, tended to make it so appear that imperial rivalries would necessarily result in clash of empires. It is curious, however, as historians have pointed out, that there are instances abundant all over the history of this period between 1817 and 1914 that imperialism has actually encouraged elements of collaboration. So, the French annexation of Tunisia, for instance, or British annexation of Ashanti in the 1890s, it has been argued, was meant to prevent actually from border disputes degenerating into something like a general conflict. So, imperial expansion is not necessarily connected in any way towards the notion of imperial clashes, to clash of empires. Clashes, as much as collaboration, are historically conditioned, and they develop in terms of the space and time in which such confrontations are played out. If we look at the history of the age of empire, the age of European imperialism in the late closing years of the 19th century, one can find that one of the best instances of collaboration takes place in the 1880s. The International Africa Association, set up by King Leopold of Belgium, sent the Welsh explorer Henry Morgan Stanley to the Congo region, where in course of a series of treaties signed during 1879 and 84, he established diplomatic relations between Belgium and numerous native rulers. This was before Africa was carved up. Now, this alarmed two older colonial powers in the region, Britain and Portugal, who then in their turn set up a commission to regulate navigation along the Congo River, principally at the behest of Lisbon, in its desire to safeguard its colonial presence in Angola. Seeking to avoid any confrontation, King Leopold sought mediation by France and Germany, two powers who would not normally be taken as capable of being in cahoots on anything. And by this time, France was looking at its own entry into the equatorial region north of Congo, and Germany was also beginning to make inroads into Cameroon. In this background, despite their recent history of antagonism, Germany, led by Bismarck, and France, led by Jules Ferry, collaborated on an international conference at Berlin in 1884 to arbitrate over the Congo issue. 14 European countries, with the exception of Switzerland, came forward to identify their respective spheres of influence or interest. It was decided that if any power were to establish its influence on any region in Africa after informing other European powers, such expansion would be accepted by the others as legitimate. The conference marked the beginning of an organized penetration of Africa. In 1885, the sphere of interest identified by the International Africa Association was declared to be the Congo Free State. This inspired other chartered companies to appear and begin by acquiring commercial monopolies and then transforming these monopolies into territorial acquisition. By 1888, the German and the British East Africa companies had been founded. In 1889, Sir Cecil Rhodes set up South Africa Chartered Company, whose northward ventures eventually led to the foundation of Rhodesia, which today comprises the states of Zambia and Zimbabwe. The Italian company in Somaliland was set up in 1892. The British set up the Royal Niger Company in 1896. That is to say, almost every European company had set up a protectorate somewhere in Africa and opened it up exclusively for its own industrial exploitation. So Germany did the same in Togoland, Cameroon, Southwest Africa and East Africa. France in Dahomey, Algeria, Senegal, Guinea and a large swathe of West Africa and Equatorial Central Africa, apart from a part of Somaliland, and in Madagascar in 1896. The British initially held the Cape of Good Hope, whence they moved into Bechuanaland in 1885, Rhodesia in 1889 and Nyasaland in 1893. This expansion at the initiative of Cecil Rhodes virtually drove a wedge between the German colonies of East Africa and Southwest Africa, and it paved the way for conflicts between Britain and Dutch Boer colonists of Transvaal and the Orange Free State, which together was later to become the Republic of South Africa. There were also British acquisition of East Africa in 1888, Uganda in 1894 and Nigeria in two phases in 1886 and 1895. Italy occupied Eritrea in 1885, Asmara in 1899 and a part of southern Somaliland immediately thereafter. They had also established control over Abyssinia, but they lost it in 1896 to Abyssinian troops. The point here is the most of the carving up of the African colonies that took place in the closing years of the 19th century was essentially a collaborative venture, occasioning very few incidents of contest in the early phases. What is interesting, however, is that elsewhere in Asia, in Europe and in some parts of Africa, this would inevitably result in conflict. In Asia, the Russian expansion into Central Asia and its approaching the Arabian Sea resulted in British apprehensions of endangering its access to India, its command over India. Then Russian expansion into the Balkans, which resulted in major apprehensions in Vienna, leading on to almost head-on collision between the Habsburg Empire and the Romanov Empire in the closing years of in the last quarter of the 19th century. So imperial rivalries did not necessarily lead towards clashes and rivalries. They were historically conditioned, as we have already argued, by the actual contingent situation in different parts of the world. Looking at the imperial rivalries that were occasioned in the second half of the 19th century, we can identify an interesting factor that was there in common. In almost all the major conflicts that took place in the second half of the 19th century, there was a very decidedly British element present in almost all the confrontations. Towards the second half of the 19th century, Britain developed conflict of interest with France in Africa and with Russia in Asia. Towards the beginning of the 20th century, Britain began to develop conflicts with Germany as well. And it was in fact one of the reasons why Britain decided to end its diplomatic aloofness from European politics. The other element that begins to be very noticeable was in the 2 decades before, in fact the decade and a half before the outbreak of the Great War, Germany rather than Britain was the central element of all major colonial conflicts, especially in Africa. And because Britain and Germany happened to be the two pivots around which the colonial rivalries degenerated into the First World War, these need to be taken a bit seriously. In the arena of international diplomacy, one has to understand that colonial rivalries frequently trigger strategic alignments. And the principal reason why Britain became embroiled in so many different sorts of colonial conflicts was that Britain in the early part of the 19th century had taken on a policy of diplomatic isolation from the rest of Europe. because political balance in Europe, so long as it was not unfavorable to British commerce, did not affect Britain in any way. But the power balance in Europe frequently played out on a larger arena. So the confrontation that existed between Vienna and St. Petersburg, for instance, over the domination of the Balkans, frequently dragged Berlin into the fray and opened up the possibility of a veritable clash of empires on the main continent of Europe, in which the three major powers would be embroiled. Similarly, the idea of clashes of interests between Britain and France could have major repercussions in European politics as well. The British position had been, since the close of the 18th century, when French colonial empire had collapsed, that British global domination was unchallenged. Powered by the Industrial Revolution on the one hand and the world's most powerful navy on the other, Britain saw no existential threat emerging from any quarter. So in the early part of the 19th century, Britain adopted a posture of diplomatic aloofness, diplomatic isolation, because no military alignment in Europe was of any interest to it, because its principal concerns were perfectly safe. Towards the second half of the 19th century, however, as the race for colonial empires began to escalate, British isolation, British aloofness began to become something like a diplomatic isolation, where all the powers were somehow ranged against it. Most of the time, British preoccupations were driven by its own imperial presence around the world, and that is where the root of most conflicts of the later half of the 19th and early half of the 20th century could be seen. In the 19th century, the principal element of British supremacy in global politics tended to be its industrial power on the one hand, and second, its vast colonial empire on the other, particularly India. Having the secure market of the large Indian subcontinent, British industry managed to develop something like a cushion which none of the other European industrial economies had. As a result, Britain rightly identified India as the pivot in its global domination, and anything that remotely threatened British control over India was therefore likely to set alarm bells ringing in London. The factor that provoked the British most constantly from the 19th century had been Russian expansion into Asia. As Russia began to penetrate into the Caspian and Caucasian regions, opening up large swathes of Caspian territory, acquiring them from the Kingdom of Persia, Britain was confronted with the possibility that, pursuing its policy of warm waters, Russia might reach the Arabian Sea. And were that to happen, there was a good possibility, Britain believed, that British domination of the Arabian Sea, British domination of the Indian Ocean would be challenged. This is a reason why Britain was adamant in resisting Russian advances in this region. And Britain involved itself extensively in the politics of Persia and politics of Afghanistan to keep Russia out of these. There was the other factor which was equally crucial, perhaps more crucial. This was the fate of the Ottoman Empire vis-a-vis Russian expansionism. Now, Britain had no interest in the Balkans the way the Austro-Hungarian Empire had. British concern had essentially been to keep the Ottoman Empire intact and free of Russian influence, because British contacts between India and the metropolitan region of Great Britain happened to be of two sorts, from two directions. One was the sea route, which was a much larger and much more time consuming and much more hazardous sea route, whereby the British vessels would sail down the African coastline and then move up from the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean. It took a very long while. For much more swifter communication, the British relied on moving through the Mediterranean and then traversing the Ottoman Empire either overland or through the Red Sea, coming once again into the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea. Russian expansion into the Mediterranean, especially Russian challenge to in repeated occasions in order to acquire the Straits of Dardanelles and Bosphorus, or at least Russian presence there, was meant to be a threat to this route to India, both land and sea route to India. So the British resisted any attempt by the Russians all the time expanding in this direction. This was the reason why the Crimean War took place, when Russia suddenly advanced into the Black Sea region, and Britain initially began by a unilateral determination to stop Russian advance, but then was joined in by other interested European powers. Once the matter of the Crimean War was settled, Britain began to look for an alternative, because the Ottoman Empire was so visibly weak that it was quite an effort to hold it back up. Britain found this solution in two different ways. The first was Britain gradually began to penetrate into the region of Suez, and in the 1860s and 80s it managed, in association with the French, to open up the Egyptian economy, which was technically a part of the Ottoman Empire, to British and French financial investment. In this wake of financial investment, the British penetration transpired into the creation of the Suez Canal, which opened a sea link to India, which made Cape of Good Hope not necessary. So the British had simply to move down the Mediterranean and then down the Red Sea in order to arrive at the Indian Ocean. When British challenge to Egypt was threatened by nationalist forces inside the region of Egypt, Britain in 1882 managed to take over militarily in order to safeguard the Suez Canal zone, as also British interests in this part of the world. This resulted in a major furor with France, because France had a stake in Egyptian economy, in Egyptian finances. Britain, to be fair, had proposed that France participate in establishing a protectorate, a sort of condominium over Egypt, but France had backed out. But when Britain gradually moved in and took over the whole of Egypt, this alarmed France beyond recognition. But nevertheless, the British valued Egypt so much that they were willing to risk even a confrontation with France, and even a confrontation with the Ottoman Empire if need be, because the Suez Canal and Egypt made it convenient for the British to keep the sea route to India easily open. This was also the reason why, from the middle of the 1880s, the British were no longer interested in maintaining the rest of the Ottoman Empire, because so long as the British held Egypt, the strategic significance of the Ottoman Empire in opening the route to India had diminished considerably. The challenge, therefore, for the British, the challenge that they had always braced up to, was to keep the route to India open. And this remained the driving consideration in British policies towards other imperial expansion. There was, however, a second thing that needs to be appreciated. British domination of Africa had begun originally with the Indian Ocean trade in mind. But with time, Africa too generated its own impulses. Britain had, by the second half of the 19th century, begun to realize that it was not possible for Britain to contest all the global or all the various clashes of interest that might emerge in various parts of the world. So British interests in the continent of the Americas, both in the north and in the south, leading to a head-on confrontation in terms of interests with the emergent economy of United States of America made it extremely unlikely that Britain would be able to outcompete the Americans in their own hinterland. The prospect of a military confrontation also was swiftly ruled out because it would have made Britain overreach to an extent where it could not hold. So Britain gradually began to consider dismantling its presence, its colonial and imperial presence, whatever that remained of it, in the Americas, retaining only a financial presence. But elsewhere, especially in Africa, in those parts of Africa which were crucial to what the British considered their strategic space, in order to safeguard the passage to India, there was to be no compromise. So the French colonial expansion, which begins in the 1880s, was alarming the British considerably. This, in fact, was one of the reasons why that both in the Mediterranean and in the Africas, Britain wanted an easy and a quick solution, an amicable solution to all rivalries that might emerge. British Empire therefore encouraged the French to move into Tunisia, hoping that thereby French desire to have a major base in the Mediterranean be satisfied. In return, they were hoping that the French would stay out of Egypt, where they had already invested enormous strategic and economic capital. Alongside this was this gradual British disentanglement, if we can see, from the Ottoman Empire, because the strategic realities of the 1880s had changed once an independent Bulgaria emerged with an independent mind of its own, determined to keep Russia out. Britain was no longer interested in keeping Russia out of the Balkans as well, because Britain was reasonably confident that this would be done by the Bulgarians themselves. So British contestation of Russia began to decline somewhat after 1887, and you will be hard put to find any major conflict between 1887 and 1914 that was to take place between the British and the Russians. 1885-87 in fact is a dividing line, because by this time all the conflicts that were emerging in Persia, then with the Panjshir affair in Afghanistan, where Russia moved into the region and Britain unilaterally threatened movement into the Straits of Dardanelles to attack Russia as if from the south, which led, of course, to its swift arbitration and resolution. The Panjshir crisis, the Persian affair, the Persian entanglement, and the Bulgarian issue of 1887, all of these show that in each case of confrontation of in terms of imperial rivalry, as also the Fashoda incident afterwards, Britain was diplomatically completely isolated. And in this manner, Britain was prompted to move out of this diplomatic isolation, and Britain was willing to settle as much as possible. Now, in the 1890s, the principal choice for Britain had been Germany, because Germany was the only major European power with which Britain had no conflict of interest but had a convergence of interest. With Austria-Hungary, Britain had no conflict of interest, but neither was there any convergence of interest after an independent Bulgaria had come up. By contrast, British colonial rivals France and Russia had a point of concern in Germany, and Germany too was concerned that France and Russia might come together, as they did in 1894. Britain was desperately looking for an ally with which it could counter the Franco-Russian alignment. Germany was willing to step forth, but because Germany was not going to be of much use in contesting Russia in Asia, Britain decided that time was not yet ripe to close the deal with Germany. The Germans got the message in Berlin that Britain would not move into an alignment unless Germans were strong enough to make it appear so attractive that they could not say no. So the Germans in 1897, partly out of this strategic calculation of becoming a global power following the policy of Weltpolitik, as also the need to generate major economic activity at home, embarked on a policy of the naval buildup. Britain was concerned that if German navy began to develop as fast as it was proposed, then very swiftly the major defense doctrine along which the British Empire operated, the 2+ doctrine, would become irrelevant. According to the 2+ doctrine, the British Navy had to be stronger than the next two biggest navies put together. And the manner in which American Navy was expanding and the German Navy was proposed to expand, this would have thrown the 2+3 theory out of the window. Britain in the early years of the 20th century therefore began to propose to Germany that there should be some kind of alignment, but upon the condition that Germany would have to put a cap on its naval buildup. This Germany could not accept because of its domestic political considerations. From that point on, Britain began to consider Germany a threat. And as in the early years of the 20th century, German economic and colonial penetration of the northern part of Africa began to develop apace, particularly in the light of the Boer Wars which the British had to fight in the year 1900. Britain began to identify Germany as its principal threat. From this to alignment with France and Russia, settling all minor colonial disputes was a very short step. And this led to the formation of what was known as the Triple Entente to contest the German colonial ambition in the early 20th century. So the clash of empires that emerged in the early part of the 20th century was a direct response, or let's say a direct aftermath of the responses that Britain had to generate in the light of colonial expansion in the closing years of the 19th century. There was nothing inevitable about it when it began, say, in the 1870s. But given the trajectory of decisions taken in course of the next 40 years, the clash of empires became a greater reality than the collaborative ventures in colonial expansion could ever have done.